Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. On behalf of all of us behind the scenes here at Fourth Space, welcome everyone in person or via Zoom to a conversation with Catherine Russell, one of Concordia's distinguished university research professors. Katie will be in conversation with colleague Heidi Wasson here today. Welcome and thank you both for joining us in person. We are coming to you live from Concordia University's Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And as caretakers for the lands and waters that we are meeting on today, we would like to signal really how grateful we are to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, we work to connect people to the initiatives, research projects, and dialogues that are happening across the university. So we are pleased to once again have the opportunity to collaborate with our colleagues in the Office of the VP Research and Graduate Studies to host this series of conversations between Concordia's distinguished university research professors and their colleagues. This is a live recording that you're attending today, and in due course, it will be edited and released as a podcast across our channels, so look out for that. But for now, we are live streaming this event on YouTube, and you're here on Zoom, and I'll share that link in the chat in just a minute. We have reserved a few minutes at the end for any questions that those of you joining us might have, so feel free to raise a virtual hand and we can unmute you so that you might speak. Otherwise, the Q&A is also activated for you to throw your ideas, feedback, or questions in there via text. That's it for me. It's my pleasure now to pass it over to Interim Vice President, Research and Graduate Studies, Paula Wood-Adams. Welcome, Paula.
Thanks, Anna. With research excellence a hallmark at Concordia, it's no surprise that our faculty members are among the most celebrated researchers in their fields. From new discoveries and the continued expansion of knowledge, our researchers are known locally, nationally, and internationally. And while we have various research awards and accolades at Concordia, the title of Distinguished University Research Professor is unique. This annual distinction is Concordia's most prestigious form of recognition for overall research achievements. It recognizes faculty members who have demonstrated outstanding and sustained distinction in research over the course of their careers. They must be recognized nationally and internationally for both impact and leadership in their field. Since the award began in 2018, only 8 researchers have been awarded the milestone title. Catherine Russell, a professor in film studies at the Mel Hoppenheim School of Cinema, was one of the first 2 recipients of this honor. An event like this one today is an opportunity to learn more about her distinguished academic and research career. Join Heidi Wasson, also a film studies professor, as she engages Catherine about her achievements. Over to you.
Thank you, Paula. So I have the distinct pleasure, I'm Heidi Wasson, and the distinct pleasure of interviewing Dr. Catherine Russell. I'll give her a brief introduction and then we will continue on with our discussion. Dr. Catherine Russell holds a PhD granted in 1990 from the storied New York University Film Department in New York City. She has researched and taught at Concordia since receiving her degree that very same year. During her 33 years in the Mel Hoppenheim School of Cinema here in Montreal, she has played a key leadership role in helping to build 3 graduate programs and, more generally, to help make that unit one of the strongest in North America. Along the way, she has produced a remarkable 6 single-authored books. In addition to this, she performs a significant amount of editorial work, but she's also authored some 35 journal articles, 24 book chapters, and penned some 40 book reviews. And I pulled this from her formidable record because, for me, book reviews are a sign of her enduring intellectual generosity. She's always engaging with the work of others. As a sign of her influence, her scholarship is not only widely reviewed and cited, but it has also been frequently reprinted as well as translated. She is regularly invited to speak internationally about her work, and in 2018, she became Concordia's one of their first 2 distinguished university research professors. Now, the fullness and breadth of Dr. Russell's writing on cinema cannot be simply summed up with a single word or subject area. Indeed, her scholarship is partly impressive for the ways in which each book seems to notably depart from the one before. From experimental film to ethnographic questions to Japanese cinema to Hollywood, she writes about contemporary art practices as well as silent cinema audiences. She even wrote an essay on hats. Despite the breadth of her work, there are a few core themes that run through her voluminous and important writing. First, there is a persistent commitment to experimental and art film. Second, there is a deep investment in feminism and commercial cinema. And third, she has contributed irrefutably to what we call historiography. That is, she has persistently explored creative and critical ways to help us better understand how images shape the very basic ways in which we think about history itself, how it gets written, how we express it, and what it means. So what we're going to do here today is invite her to say a little more about these three core through lines of her work. But first, I thought we might get started by asking Dr. Russell, who also goes by Katie, to say a little bit about how she came to be a film scholar. How did you become interested in studying film and writing about film as a profession?
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for that very nice introduction. Yeah, how did I get started? I was an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto, and they had some film courses, not a lot. I did a very scattered kind of undergraduate career, but I took philosophy courses and ended up majoring in philosophy. But at some of the film courses, they were things like, it was the beginning of the sort of theoretical turn in film studies. So I learned, a bit of semiotics, a little psychoanalysis, a little feminism, avant-garde cinema, a little bit of a Hitchcock, and it just seemed such like a dynamic field and very young and very new. And it struck me as a place you could apply philosophical concepts. I found that philosophy was just a little bit too abstract and dry for me, and I thought that film offered many ways to go. And as it turns out, I think it is a very interdisciplinary discipline, and you can go down many, many roads, and I have done. And so I guess that's the main answer.
And then you ended up at New York University at a really important point in the history of what it means to study film and that institution. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what it meant to be in New York as a Canadian, studying film there.
Well, yeah, it was really dynamic in terms of the screening opportunities, and I learned a lot just from going to the movies. And I was a poor student, so it wasn't like I was going uptown and seeing anything in the big theaters. They were little theaters, collectives, and there was a really great cohort of international students, and I think I learned a lot from being amongst them and learning with them about cinema. It was a very dynamic period in New York, but it was also a bit grim. I mean, that was the period of AIDS crisis, and so some of my fellow students became sick, some became activists. So you're kind of like thrown into the middle of a very vibrant scene in the 1980s.
And how does that converge with studying movies? What did movies have to do with the politics of the 80s?
Well, I guess there were avant-garde filmmakers who were making what we would call committed films. The history of the avant-garde up until then, the way it was taught, was about sort of formalism, visionary filmmakers, artist films, and so on. And during that period, filmmakers like Yvonne Rainer, who somebody actually worked with as a performer, were making avant-garde films that meant something about feminism and AIDS and real estate and all kinds of things, and using experimental techniques to kind of get involved with the social formation in which we all lived. And that was very new, very exciting. And though I was not a filmmaker, I felt proximate to that scene.
So you just dropped a little seed, Katie. You said you worked with Yvonne Rainer as a performer.
No, I
What-
was an extra. It's one of her films. I think it's I can't remember the title of it. The Man Who Loved Everyone or Hated Everyone. And there's a lot of students in that film, not just me. A lot. She cast from film studies courses at NYU because we were game, you know.
Oh, but it's an interesting insight into your formation as a scholar, is that you've always had a little bit of a relationship to filmmaking and the creative production-based side of things.
A little bit, not a lot.
Some.
I can't make any claims to being a filmmaker.
Fair enough. That makes you honest. So once you left New York University and came to Concordia, you were on to your second book at this point, which is what I want to focus on now, because your most influential book, I would say, is a book called Experimental Ethnography. And this book was published by Duke University Press, one of the best in the world for the humanities, in 1999. And the book pivots on what was a very surprising and original assertion at the time, an assertion that has since become rather commonplace, actually, that experimental filmmaking, a practice within the arts, and ethnography, a kind of sub-area of anthropology, share a common thread, that they're intimately intertwined. And it became a very rich entry point for a field of debates that's still growing, that links film studies, that is the study of art, filmmaking, that is the making of art, but also disciplines across the social sciences, in particular anthropology. So I wanna dive into that a little bit and ask you a little more about that book, but maybe we might start with the title. Can you explain to us the term experimental ethnography and what that meant to you?
Yeah, well, I guess it was inspired partly by work that was coming out of literature, like by writers like James Clifford and Michael Fisher, who were reconsidering ethnographic film and anthropology from a post-colonial perspective, and suggesting that ethnography would benefit from a little bit more cutting up, you know, and a little bit more experimentation with the way stories are told. And I found that this was a really useful approach to think about film, experimental film, and also some early silent film, and that models of this experimental ethnography could be found in film that might be useful for anthropologists to figure out how to do this and to see kind of examples. And it's sort of by shifting your perspective and looking at an experimental film as if it were anthropology, as if it were a modality of ethnography, even though it may not have been made with that kind of intention. And so I wanted to sort of bring some of the concepts and practices in film studies to bear on anthropology, and also vice versa. I found that the discourse of around experimental film was kind of stuck in this formalist model, and if we took some concepts from anthropology and the social sciences and brought those to bear on experimental film, we could perhaps appreciate what some filmmakers were doing beyond formalism and beyond art, just simply art for art's sake, but they were really being inventive in the ways they were looking at people, representing people, engaging with societies, and so forth.
That also suggests that these experimental filmmakers were creating a kind of knowledge that entered into a larger discussion. Could you say a little bit about what the knowledge was that these filmmakers were offering? What were the insights gleaned from their practice?
Well, you know, there's a lot. And so like that book has 10 chapters. And so there's many different kinds of types of knowledge that were brought. I mean, one of the chapters of that book that what was surprisingly to me, but very popular and much cited, is about autoethnography. And so I started looking at diary filmmakers and filmmakers who were taking their own lives, their families' lives, and engaging them in experimental ways, and making experimental films that still had a sort of a documentary aspect to them, but also kind of questioning, where do I come from, who am I, identity, politics, and that kind of thing. And so, which people were not talking a lot about in the 90s. And so I think, well, why don't we think about these films as ethnographies, as self-ethnographies? Again, that concept, autoethnography, had already existed in literature. So it was a matter of taking some kind of ideas that I read about in post-colonial type of approaches to anthropology and applying them to cinema.
So how is autoethnography different from autobiography? What's the specifics that makes it ethnographic rather than simply biographical?
It's engagement with visual culture, I would say, because ethnography tends to be about representation and images and film and photography, and so thinking on the level of the image. I think that's the main difference.
Gotcha. You once told me a fantastic story about. First of all, I want to say it's hard to underestimate how important this book was that you wrote. It's still quoted, it still gets cited in calls for papers, for journals, for conferences, journals, books. You are still frequently invited to talk about this. So I just want to make sure that that's emphasized. It's an incredible contribution to it's a field expanding book, and I think it's seeded a lot of research for generations to come. But it has very humble and actually Concordia-based roots. You told me this great story about how you came to write the book, and I'm wondering if you might share that with us today.
Sure. I mean, because it was sort of after, it was my second book, so I was no longer in graduate school, and I was sort of teaching myself in a sense about all of these different discourses that I was bringing to bear on each other. And at the time, we did not have any graduate programs in film studies, but there was the MFA program in studio arts that included film production students as well as artists and other disciplines. And I was able to teach the theory course for, 6 or 7 years. And I basically workshopped my ideas, showed the films that I was interested in, and worked through those ideas with those students. And I think that they gave a lot to my thinking. And as a result of that, or for whatever reason, I think one of the reasons the book has remained so popular, as you have said, is because artists are very much, and filmmakers are very much inspired by it. And I still get, letters and notes from students all over the world saying, your book was so helpful to me in making my movie. Would you like to see my movie? And, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But definitely it was nice to be at Concordia. I was lucky to be at Concordia at that time, I have to say. I was glad that we eventually got our own graduate programs, but they're very different types of graduate programs. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a great testament to how important interdisciplinary work is, but also that blend of practice and making, theory and art, how it comes together so powerfully and importantly. So I'm going to switch topics a little bit. We've worked together for 20 years, and we have an interestingly parallel set of research interests. One of them is about archives. And my first book charted the ideas and practices that were necessary to even think about film as something that might be saved or put in an archive. That basic idea wasn't obvious, as this book shows, and film was very ephemeral. No one thought it might matter again. You might not want to see it. Why would you save a movie? Who does that kind of thing? And you've come at a similar topic from a very different angle, which is you suppose the existence of an archive, but instead of thinking of it as a place where things are saved, you think of it as a powerfully creative site, a place to make rather than keep or save. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, this is actually your most recent book called Archivology, 2018, also published by Duke University. So I'd like to start by just asking you about your concept of the archive and how productive it was for you to rethink what that is or how it can be thought about.
Yeah, well, it's definitely an evolving concept. I mean, I think what archives are is in process. It's changing all the time. But definitely there's a way in which the digital archive makes everything much more accessible And so that's kind of one of the starting points, even though the book is historical and I go back to films that were made in the 1920s and the 1940s. The concept of archivology is about making films out of other films, using film clips and excerpts to make new films. And this is a practice that has traditionally been called found footage filmmaking. And I wanted to kind of switch the emphasis to recognize the fact that these types of filmmakers making films out of other films are researchers. They're not just finding things by accident, but they're engaging with archives. And that can be, the old kind of archive of celluloid film, but that practice has become much more easy to do. There's more archives accessible with digital materials. And by working with archival images and clips, they're bringing archives to life, because the concept of the archive, the old-fashioned kind of the archive, is storage, and it's in the dark. And when do you get to see a 16mm film? Very rarely, more and more rarely. But many film museums are putting their collections online, or parts of their collections online. So students, in our classes can make their own archivology projects by engaging with materials. And by doing so, they're able to engage with history and think of new ways of telling stories about history by using the materials that were shot in the past, and that could be the distant past or the recent past. So that's basically the concept behind archivology. And it's about experimental film, but it's also experimental film as it kind of impinges on documentary. And so it is in a sense a sequel to experimental ethnography, because there's a chapter in experimental ethnography that is about found footage filmmaking. And at the time, in the late 90s, I was very skeptical. I don't know, I was kind of caught up in the postmodernist, trend of the end of history. People aren't making their own films, they're making films out of other films, and must be the end of the world or something like that. Apocalypse. Well, there were a lot of apocalyptic themes in
including
found
the end
film.
of cinema.
Yeah.
Or death of cinema.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, some 20 years later, I'm thinking, wait a second, I don't agree anymore. And it's clear that this is a resource, and it's a very rich resource. And many filmmakers have been and continue to use it for very, I think, progressive and productive purposes, to rethink marginalized histories and also different perspectives on history, and to be able to show it and get it out of the dark and into the light.
One of the other things you're talking about too is the shift to a completely different technological suite or conditions in which artists are making what we used to call films, but never touching the old tools that they used to use. There was 20 years ago, I remember, death of cinema, death of film studies. What are we going to do?
Right.
And that is completely shifted now, where the digital tools are not just de facto what they are, they're everywhere, but they're productive and important, and they've dissolved all kinds of boundaries along the way. I'm wondering if you could say a little more about digital tools as productive tools for thinking about and making experimental art films.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not a digital media theorist, so most of my work is historical, but for sure you can see that anybody can do it. Anybody can do it. Should everybody do it? I don't know.
That's an entirely different question.
Yeah, but even in our discipline of as film scholars, I recently did make a video essay. Again, I'm not a filmmaker. I made it in collaboration with a filmmaker, but I was able to show something about my more recent project on Barbara Stanwyck that I felt like I couldn't get across in writing, and I was able to do so through finding specific clips of her horseback riding and mixing them with text. It's not all images, but it's a video essay, And this has become, I think, a very valuable venue, shall we say, opportunity for film scholars to say things about film beyond writing. And like I say, I am not a filmmaker. I appreciate the skills of people who do this very well, and I would like to do it again, but I'm strictly into collaborating with people who have the expertise, because I respect the expertise of people who actually know how to work with digital tools. I don't think we can just take it for granted.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'm going to move on. I could talk to you about that for a very long time. This is a slightly heavy question.
Okay.
Prep yourself. I was walking to work today and, listening to the news, and the Russian war in the Ukraine is on all our minds. I can't avoid that. The consequent massive migrations underway, it's got me thinking about previous wars and previous migrations caused by fascist leaders. In your writing, here's the link, you rely heavily on a very, very famous dislocated writer, Walter Benjamin, who fled Nazi Germany near the end of the 1930s. And you open your book, the Archivology book, by citing his work. And just to paraphrase, he was somebody who wrote in the spirit of the modernist avant-garde. And Benjamin, implored writers whom he considered to be as much engineers as artists, that is, makers of a better future, to use the tools of mass media to create new insights, new critiques, new ways to understand the failures of the present and the promise of the future. And you quote his famous essay, The Author as Producer, where he argues that criticism, writing, is obliged to, quote, lift the mask of pure art and show that there is no neutral ground for art. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that particular statement and the work of Walter Benjamin in general on your research.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, I've used Benjamin in pretty much all of my different projects, and I feel like he was one of the first people, or one of the most outspoken people to recognize that artists are not outside of society; they're part of society. He himself was a committed historian, which is to say that he was a historian, and he wrote about writers like Proust and Baudelaire. But he was also a committed historian, that he wanted to return to history in order to think about the future. And he was very much invested in what he called the failed promise of modernity, and the ideas that were hatched, in the 19th century that led to the disasters of the 20th century. And he was a precarious worker, throughout the interwar period. And so he was conscious of the present. The present tense is always precarious, and always on the brink of disaster. So he kind of wrote from the middle of what he perceived as chaos and disaster throughout his lifetime. And so his writing is all about kind of seizing the moment of danger and thinking through that moment and its potential for critical change and transformation. And to be sure, there's a way in which he had a kind of a mystical side to him, and that's why he became marginalized. One of the reasons why he became marginalized within the sort of philosophy, institution, and discipline. But I think that he has become an important reference point for thinkers and artists in the last 50 years, for sure, because he was kind of thinking through images, and he was thinking through visual culture, and thinking that could be a way of thinking historically, and not being so attached to texts and so on, but be able to look at the moment that you're in as being very dynamic. And for him, images, photographic images and film images, had that potential within them, because there's always this historical disjunction at the heart of the image, that it was, we're now looking at the image and it was filmed then, and so it's really about how to think through the moment in chaos as having potential.
Only, and he did so in such a compelling way because he didn't just look at high art anything. He ran the gambit within one sentence sometimes. And so it's one of the things that made his writing so compelling is that he embraced the detritus, the waste, the repetitions, the throwaway, and tried to figure out what it meant and actually use it as a critical tool. Yeah.
Well, yeah, his writing was as much informed by Dadaism and Surrealism as anything else, and he wanted to try doing theory that way, which makes him sometimes difficult to parse, but also very poetic. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why he's been so inspirational to artists and filmmakers, more so perhaps than philosophy. That's where you'll see his name more often pop up.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. So here's the fun stuff. I want to ask you about your feminism, Katie. You have another thread that runs through your work that is expressly feminist, and it tends to be the thread, not exclusively, but it tends to be the thread where you address commercial cinema, not experimental art cinema. And so I guess I want to turn to that a little bit and ask you to talk about your writing on commercial film and feminism in particular. I wonder if we could start with, you wrote a colossally important book on Japanese director Mikio Naruse. This is a filmmaker who made over 100 films, and you took it on, first of its kind. And Naruse, according to your work, we know now, was well known for his melodramas, mid-century melodramas, which were also called women's films. So you do something interesting with that work, which is to talk about the ways in which Naruse worked within the film industry, but critically commented upon not just Japanese society, but in particular gender dynamics within that. And he used popular cinema to do it. So could you tell us a little bit about your book and that contribution?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to say that he was critical, I think, is a bit of a stretch because it's a very subtle mode of criticism. And so part of my project was to kind of develop another perspective on his work, which is at an angle for sure to how his films were perceived in Japan, and my work has not been translated into Japanese, and there's probably a reason for that. They were sort of accepted as beautiful artworks. He was the #4 director in Japan, and there was not really a lot of discussion about the films in Japan as feminist works. However, these are based on stories written by women. They're starring some of the most amazing actresses in world film history, in my opinion. And there's stories about single mothers, lonely housewives, unrequited love, the challenges of sex workers. And there's stories about these women who are facing real issues of everyday life in 20th century Japan. Almost all of his films are set in the contemporary period. They're not samurai films with, geisha and stuff like that. They're all in the period. And so they for me, they provide really valuable insight into Japanese culture and the gender dynamics. And over the period of his career from 1930 to mid-60s, you can see how those dynamics evolve, and how things change from one decade to the next, because that was a really incredibly transformational 30 years of Japanese history, mid-century Japan. And so I wanted to look at them from that perspective. So that's why it's called Women in Japanese Modernity. And yeah, and I really loved the films, and I really enjoyed writing the book. It was one of those books, like, I don't want it to end because the films are so beautiful to watch. And for sure, he's become one of the kind of recognized world film directors. And so for me, part of the idea of taking a Western feminist approach is, yes, he's a Japanese filmmaker, but he's also a world filmmaker, and people are watching his films all over the world. And so,
where did they circulate his films?
Well, they're Criterion, released by Criterion, on DVD. There's like
At the time, did they circulate? Though?
At the
In
the
50s and
time,
60s,
no. He wasn't never seen outside of Japan, hardly at all. Whereas Kurosawa, Mizoguchi, and Ozu were widely circulated, and there's almost a way in which the Japanese thought these films would not be interesting to, they didn't have that Orientalist, period feel to them. They're very normal films. I mean, they're gorgeous, but they were industry products that were. He was a salary man in the sense that he was a reliable industry worker who stayed under budget, and people came out to watch his movies.
Fascinating. So you've said he is an observer of the desires and disappointments of Japanese women. Could you say more about what those desires and disappointments were?
Well, again, it's like the failed promise of modernity, democracy. After the war, the Americans came in with this big democratic plan. Women would be, recognized and liberated, but of course they weren't. They things remain more or less the same. There's a lot of prejudices against women working, and a lot of gender blocks to them moving forward. And so, their desires and their disappointments, their desires may not have been necessarily to be professionals, but desires to have a family, that kind of thing would be continually thwarted by the depression, by depressed circumstances, wayward men, slacker, loser men, that kind of thing that would stand in their way. And there's so few job opportunities for them to have. So it's really about the economics. Sometimes even the economics of running a hostess bar. That was one of the occupations that women did do, is sort of the geishas of the late 20th century. And but these films will go into the complicated economics that are inevitably bound up with gender politics and romance, and having to get funding from men and being dependent on men.
Well, we see over and over again in film history the crucial ways in which commercial modes of cinema have actually enabled new voices, new stories to be told, and new realities to be explored in ways that high arts weren't always as quick to come to. So it's a really important part of that puzzle. Your second book that's expressly feminist on commercial cinema is the one you're working on now, which I think is on its way to print.
It's in production.
It's in production, so it's any day now coming out. And this is my secret favorite of your work, I have to say, is your project on Barbara Stanwyck, who is a prominent Hollywood star for decades, and a particularly interesting one. And your project takes a rather unconventional approach, as we might expect from you now, to unpacking her legacy. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about the book and how you structured it, but also just tell us about Stanwyck and why you've adopted this approach, because I assume her particular legacy.
Yeah, she's completely fascinating character. And I wanted to write a woman's history of Hollywood. And like other scholars, feminist scholars, I quickly came to the conclusion that you have to write history differently in order to capture women's contribution to Hollywood, because there were very few directors, but that does not mean that there were no women around, And so Barbara Stanwyck is a worker in plain sight. That's one of the ways I want to talk about her. That she was a contributor to what we know we call classical Hollywood cinema. And her contribution is in the kinds of characters she played and the kind of persona that she developed on screen, again, over a very long period of time. And so the span of her career that goes from the early 30s to the 1980s, from the like a silent film to a TV miniseries, is absolutely phenomenal. And she played tough characters, she played strong characters. She had a long career as an older woman, which was very rare. And she managed that because she realized that television was the way to go. So she had 2 TV series, including The Big Valley, which made her another star all over again in the late 1960s. But the only way to really kind of, well, the way I chose to write about her was through 26 short essays, which is somewhat modeled on Walter Benjamin's Arcades Project and the idea of having different chapters following different letters of the alphabet, which is a way of breaking up the linearity. I didn't want to write a biography. Just like really nice biographies already written about Barbara Stanwyck, and I wanted to distinguish my project from that. So I have like, a chapter A is All I Desire, which is the name of a film of hers, a great film. J is Jungle Films. E is Edith Head, who's one of her costume designers that she worked with and an important person in Hollywood. And so I wanted to take these different avenues, different paths. I mean, rabbit holes, whatever you want to call them. And and I like this methodology because you're not pretending to be comprehensive or do everything. You can't, she made hundreds of films. If you include all of her TV shows, it's like hundreds. There's no way. And I think there's some movies I never ended up being able to fit into this kind of structure. And it also enabled me to incorporate tidbits of biography as well as analyses of the films, gossip and fan magazine stuff, archival research into how the films were made, on all these different aspects of her career, as well as the people she collaborated with, because I think that's a really important part of how a star like that is successful. You have to be a good collaborator, and she saw herself that way. She saw herself, she was very, very, very well respected in Hollywood as a very good worker, showing up on time, learning her lines, memorizing her lines. And of course, as she got older, she started getting a reputation for, getting mad at some of the younger actors who weren't as...
Who deserved every bit of it, I'm sure.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did. So, she's the sort of person that, again, she should have been a director, could have been, but it wasn't. People asked her in the 60s, there's some interviews about what if she was interested in becoming a director, and why would I do that? She had respect for directors. She never overstepped her role. She never told directors what to do. But that's just the way she saw herself and her career. So anyway, it was a really, really fun project. And again, I was like, sorry to see the end of it.
Yeah, well, these things never end. But a follow-up question there, Katie, we know that figures like Stanwyck are not just people, they're stars and celebrities, and there's an interface between those two things. And it sounds like Stanwyck was particularly active at managing that public side of how do you create and then maintain a star persona over all those years, and how do you shift and adjust and strategize? And early on, her roles were particularly interesting because she often played morally complex figures. There's nothing conventional about a good deal of her roles in terms of constructions of femininity. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit about that crafting of that persona over the years, and how one strategizes to survive an industry that is notably cruel towards aging women.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And she was very much responsible for her own image. She had her own publicists. One of the things that distinguishes Stanwyck is that she was most of her career, all of her career, she was more or less freelance. She had short-term contracts with almost every studio, but she wasn't one of these people who was like managed by a studio. And so she could and did control her image. And it was this was especially important in the when she was older, because she sort of became a gay icon, you know, and because people were seeing her as a tough, strong woman redefining femininity. She made a lot of westerns through the 50s and 60s. She was one of the few women who was kind of independent, single also. She divorced her second husband in 1950, so she was a single woman through the latter part of her career. And so she very much resisted, and I think she was a bit homophobic, actually. And she very much resisted that. But to me, you know, that's okay. She's still, to me, I think a valuable icon of alternative gender roles, you know, because she played them out on screen, maybe not in her on her off-screen life, but certainly on screen. She presented a different way of being in the world as a woman. And yeah, she could do all she could to protect herself from becoming a gay icon, but it didn't really work.
Well, it's one of the great things about art. That's why we make art, because
Yeah.
it's not us.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that might be an up energy moment to say thank you very much, Katie, for sharing your work with us. It's a phenomenal career, and we're really lucky to have you here at Concordia with us.
Thank you so much for your great questions, and thank you, Paula, and everybody else for the opportunity to talk about my work. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Katie and Heidi. That was just fascinating, that conversation. We do have one question from the audience. It is, have you or will you ever make a film documentary based on one of your books?
That's great. That's a great question. I would consider collaborating, as I said to Heidi a couple of times today. I'm not a filmmaker. I have deep respect for filmmakers, students who I've taught, and friends and people I've written about. And I'm not a filmmaker. I like collaborating. I enjoyed doing the one video essay that I made, and I'd like to do that again, but only with somebody who knows what they're doing. It's too late for me to learn.
Come on, let's do Todd Haynes and you on Barbara Stanwyck. You've got to do it.
Sure. Todd, bring it on.
So I have kind of a simple question from somebody outside of the field. Can you tell me a little bit about the process of writing a book? How do you go about it? How do you organize yourself? How does it work?
Well, I think different people have different approaches. I mean, I'm a kind of a compulsive writer, and I actually got into film studies as a writer first, and realized, oh, I like writing about films. That's a good thing to write about. And well, the Barbara Stanwyck project, I just went, oh, it's like this week, I think I'll do C. What will that be? And I really did not have a great plan. But yeah, I mean, like I think most scholars, you collect a lot of stuff, do a lot of research, do a lot of reading, watch all the movies, make a plan, start the plan, scratch the plan, make a new plan, a lot of revising. Like when I say I'm a compulsive writer, I'm a compulsive reviser also. And I write a lot of, I write for Cineast magazine also, and like film reviews, just between books, between chapters. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of researching, then writing, but then researching some more, collecting. It is a process of collecting. I mean, that's one of the ways I got into the whole archive project, is because when I was working on the Japanese director Naruse, I couldn't get the films except for people sending me bootlegs, and then me getting transcripts, and me learning, you know, putting together. So I had my own little collection. So I had the complete Naruse archive in my study that didn't exist anywhere else. And then that's actually where I started really thinking about what is an archive, what can an archive be. So that's part of I think writing is collecting stuff. Yeah.
The other thing in the humanities, like, right, there's the book and then there's the writing, and they're parallel processes. And the writing is a little, I always liken it to a scientist's lab. You know, writing is our lab. And as you write, you learn and things change and you make discoveries through writing itself. And then you make it into a book. Like, so there's that formality of the book, but then there's the organic, creative, crazy experimental process of writing, which is constitutive of all the scholarship. So it's a different approach in the humanities, I'd say, because you're never just writing up the results of something.
Right.
Your writing is constitutive of the very process. So I don't know what the result, I guess the book is the result, because at a certain point you have to call it a thing and it's done, but then it goes on.
Wow, that's super interesting. You know, the process of research, I think, is common, but how you actually go through the steps is really different. So that's really really interesting.
The other thing that's really interesting about film scholarship, and you can hear it in what the things that Katie said, but she's underplayed it, is the scarcity of resources. So it's actually often very difficult to simply find the basic things you need to conduct your experiment.
Right.
That is, like, movies are gone.
Right.
Materials are lost.
Or
They
they're
weren't
in
saved
Japanese.
anyhow, or they're in Japanese. They're on the other side of a planet. We have a lot of colleagues who do work on the socialist world where there have been revolutions and archives have been burned.
Right.
So there's nothing left. So how do you write about something where there's no record anymore? So it's a really interesting part of the problem in the field itself.
Right.
Is sometimes you have to invent methodologies that compensate for the scarcity or the absence.
It's gotten easier, though.
It
Remember
has.
when we had to watch movies and you only had one chance, watch a movie in the dark, take a lot of notes.
Right.
And then that's it.
That's all
it.
you
Yeah,
had.
that's all you got.
That was the memory.
Yeah, and the very first film scholars chased movies from theater to theater.
Yeah.
Oh, and watched it again and again.
Yeah.
And took notes. Oh my
And then
gosh.
it was gone forever.
Yeah.
Right.
You worked with what you had.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And I love what you said about how you make your plan and you start writing, but then you remake your plan. I can imagine that happens a lot. I mean, that's the basic of research. It never turns out the way you think at the beginning.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Well, thank you so much, Katie. This has been just a fascinating hour listening to you and listening to the two of you really exchange on these ideas. And, you know, your work is clearly had a major impact on the field, but also on your colleagues. I can see that, and on your students. And well, that's something, it's a real achievement. So thank you for being here, Katie.
Thank you.
And Heidi, thank you so much. That was a brilliant interview.
Pleasure.
You could have a second career as an interviewer, I think.
My rates are way too high.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. That's fantastic. And I'm going to hand it over now, I believe, to Anna. Oh, not quite yet. 1 second, and then Anna will close out the session. Thanks so much.
Here I am. Hello, everybody. I will indeed, and I just wanted to thank the folks who have joined us either in the space or over Zoom. We appreciate you being here. Thanks for participating and listening to this conversation. We're so excited to take a re-listen to it, gently edit it with some love and release it as a podcast, a conversation that you can take with you on your walk as you navigate the city. So once again, thank you, Heidi, who is currently on sabbatical and made it in here to speak with Katie. We appreciate your time so much. We're gonna go ahead and close up the Zoom now, folks, and wish you a very nice sunny day. Till next time, take good care. Bye-bye.